The 19th argument that's used against belief in God, and in particular this one attacked Christian belief, is the 19th argument is entitled, "Notice that you ignore Jesus." And the bulk of the article presents a series of verses of Scripture in which Jesus makes some very strong statements about what it means to follow Him. For example, the first one reads, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And he goes on with a number of other texts, like Luke chapter 14, verse 33, "Any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple," and a number of other similar sort of references, especially ones that speak in very strong warning terms about wealth, the dangers of wealth, and the inability of persons to serve both God and money. The author on the Atheist website makes the argument from this that since Christians don't give up everything, literally give up everything and follow Jesus, therefore we don't really take Him seriously and we don't really follow Him. And I would like to say a number of things in response to this. I think this gives us an opportunity really to highlight one of the problems with this kind of atheism. And by the way, I want to be careful not to lump every atheist into the same category. I think there is the brand of atheism that we find in these various articles. It's really a kind of apologetic atheism where the author, and I see much of this, all you have to do is run a search on atheist websites and you'll see many of them like this, where their primary task seems to be, or their primary goal seems to be to insult Christians or to rally themselves in their unbelief. And so they say derogatory things, they say negative things, they try to insult Christians. If you look at some of the replies to some of the presentations that I've given, you'll see some of that. Much of it is not really a serious attempt to engage the topic at all. It's simply an attempt to insult the other person, and by belittling them or by insulting them you think that you've scored some points or made a good argument. There are other atheists, though, who are more serious and who try to engage the subject on a very serious level. And then, of course, there are Christians who just want to know how to respond to these sorts of questions. And so when I make these remarks or when I make these videos, first of all, I'm wanting to address the questions themselves for the benefit of anyone who cares to listen. If there are atheists out there who want to have a sincere, meaningful conversation about these issues, I'm more than happy to have that conversation. I'm certainly interested in helping Christians to understand how to respond to these sorts of questions, and so that's a very strong interest of mine. But as I said a moment ago, there are other atheists who are very serious about engaging a topic, and therefore they take them very seriously. And so for those, and for those Christians who would like to know how to understand these verses of Scripture, I'll offer a few thoughts to you. First of all, when I was looking at these arguments, I thought of a book that I read some years ago that was actually very, very helpful to me in thinking about these kinds of topics. It's a book by Raphael Patai called The Arab Mind, and I hold it in my hand. This book, I think, does a very interesting job talking about the way sort of the Middle Eastern and Semitic mindset works. There's a very significant chapter in here that talks about the use of language. The title of the chapter is Under the Spell of Language, and there's a very interesting section where the author talks about the use of hyperbole and exaggeration in Middle Eastern communication. And he gives a number of interesting examples. For instance, he points out that in the Middle East, in Arab countries or in Semitic countries, they find it very boring the way that we greet one another in America. We might say good morning, or how are you, or good day, or something like that. In the Middle East, that's taken to be very boring, and so what they try to do is someone will make a statement. For instance, the example that's given here is the Arab might say, they would be offended by the boring nature or the simplistic nature of this, and so they might say, if the first Arab says good morning, they might say they might say it like this: "May your day be prosperous," and then the other person might respond, "May your day be prosperous and blessed." And so they keep adding to the conversation. In other words, just to respond in a typical or predictable way is seen as not very interesting at all. It's more interesting to say something in a flowery way, or in a poetic way even. When you look at, and he gives a number of examples, by the way, also of exaggeration, the tendency toward expressing things in very extreme ways in order to make a point. Now, certainly in the English language, we also use hyperbole or exaggeration to make points. For example, I just ran a search online on examples of hyperbole in the English language, and I found numerous examples of it, but I'll give you a couple that I wrote down. A student might say, I had a ton of homework. A ton of homework obviously isn't meant to be taken literally. It's not literally a ton of homework, but we all know what it means. You're saying something in an exaggerated way to make the point, in this case, that I had a lot to do, a significant amount to do. Another would be, I have a million things to do. We would never take that literally, that you really have to do a million things. It just means you've got a very large number of things to do. Another is, we might say of a person who's very thin, he is as skinny as a toothpick. To say he's as skinny as a toothpick doesn't mean he literally is as skinny as a toothpick. Obviously, it means that he's just very thin. Another is that I wrote down is he is older than the hills. He's older than the hills. Obviously, we don't mean that literally. It just means that he's a very old person. These are just some examples of hyperbole in the English language that it would be entirely inappropriate for someone to take those as literal statements. When we look at the Gospels and the various texts that are mentioned in this particular argument or this particular article, talking about how Christians don't literally do what Jesus said to do, give up everything, don't save any money or anything like that. The atheist looks at that, ignores the Semitic and Middle Eastern context and flavor of these statements, interprets them in the most radically literal way, which would be very out of character for the context. And also, I think it's insensitive to the teachings of Jesus. If we study the teachings of Jesus, I think one of the things that made him such a powerful teacher and so interesting to people is, number one, he loved to tell stories, and people liked to listen to stories. And number two, Jesus was very effective in his use of hyperbole. And a third that I would add is he spoke with a great deal of authority, and so people loved to listen to him because he wasn't like many of the rabbis who would always qualify everything they say with various references to this rabbi or this teacher or this or the other. Jesus would speak with a kind of unique authority, and that caused people to be very interested in listening to what he had to say. But back to the second point, though, Jesus was very effective in his use of hyperbole. He would say things that because of the sharpness of them and because of the challenge of them, that would cause people to think and cause them to really seriously ponder what it is he was trying to communicate by those sayings. This is very consistent with the context and the world in which he lived. Now, Christians have read these statements for many centuries. Some of them have taken them more literally than others. In the Catholic tradition, for example, you have people who have literally left everything and gone and lived, say, in a monastery, or maybe lived in a I think of St. Francis of Assisi, who threw off even the clothes that were on his back and took to himself a beggar's garment and went and lived and served lepers and persons who were ill, and traveled about and literally had nothing. And there were great religious orders that rose up in the Middle Ages called the mendicant orders, where they interpreted or lived out these texts that we find in the Gospels in a very, very literal and radical way. But even those persons recognized that there were degrees to which people may be called to live that way. They didn't look at people who didn't take these in the most extreme way and say that they weren't Christians or that they weren't following Jesus. They just saw these statements as being an invitation to a deeper and deeper level of commitment to God and service of God and following Jesus. And the extreme or the exaggerated way in which Jesus spoke these things is lived out variously by Christians. Now you might say, well, you're just making up or you're just justifying the fact that everybody doesn't do this. But if you look at the New Testament seriously, if you take the New Testament as a whole, you'll find that there are all sorts of things that lead us to the conclusion that these texts are not to be taken in a radically literal way. To give you just one example, in the Gospel of John, as Jesus is dying on the cross, he says to John, who is called in the Gospel of John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is standing at the foot of the cross with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus speaks from the cross and says to Mary and to John, "Mother, behold your son, and son, behold your mother." And we're told that from that day forth, John, or Mary, the mother of Jesus, lived with John, and he took care of her. Now, if you take that text, you will see that Jesus here is speaking of John having a home and that he is to care for Mary, the mother of Jesus. If the teachings of Jesus are to be taken in a radically literal sense, that we're to give up everything and have absolutely nothing, not even a roof over one's head, then this text doesn't make sense. We see in the Gospel of John again, where Jesus goes to the house of Lazarus, a very good friend of his, and also his sisters, and there he stays with them and raises Lazarus from the dead, we're told. But in that text, we see that he goes to people's homes. He doesn't condemn them for having a home. So there are all kinds of things in the Gospels that lead us to the conclusion that we're not to take these statements in a radically literal way, but they do challenge us to sort of single-heartedly follow Jesus. And if that means giving up my money, if it means being extremely generous, if it means giving up all that I have to go and pursue following Jesus in some more radical way, then I should be open to that. But it doesn't mean that everybody has that same calling. And so I think that the big problem here, or the thing that I find most interesting in this atheist argument, is that instead of taking a little bit of time to see how Christians have read these texts and understood these texts, and having a little bit of sensitivity to the literary genres, to the kind of literature, the kind of communication, taking a book like the Arab Mind, which is not written to defend Christianity. The author is Jewish. He's not interested in defending Christianity at all, but he takes the data and he takes the thought patterns and the world of the Arab or the Middle Eastern mindset, and he helps us to understand how they communicate and what they say. So I think that I would invite the atheist, the one who is serious. If a person is not serious, and then obviously they don't care about what I'm saying. But if a person is serious, I think they can take the teachings of Jesus and find that they are deeply challenging. They are a deep invitation to a profound relationship with God, but yet they are not to be taken in an overly literal way. And this is not a cop-out. This is not an excuse. This is how Christians have understood these texts for millennia, and it's how the earliest Christians understood these texts. And that's why when we turn to the New Testament, we find information frequently, and I've only scratched the surface of it. We can find numerous texts in the New Testament that show us that the earliest Christians did not read these texts as a crassly literal demand to give up everything so that you have absolutely nothing left. Some people responded in that way, but that the call of Jesus is that we are to be open to following him no matter what he asks of us, but that he doesn't ask all of us to do the same thing to the same degree. And that, I think, makes the best sense of all the data in the Scriptures.